real estate, investment, bankruptcy. Get ready because it's time to raise the stakes with real estate. There are different chapters of bankruptcy we will be considering here, Chapter 7, Chapter 11, and Chapter 13. These will be definitional terms. We're going to be referencing Investopedia, which is a place you can go to further your research with regards to investment-related terminology, starting with Chapter 7. Chapter 7 being the classical type of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy being something where we're generally thinking of a liquidation type of process. In other words, if you have a business or an individual in a situation where their income, their cash inflow is not sufficient to pay off their debts, then it becomes unsustainable. They may then look into the option of saying, well, is it possible for me to liquidate, meaning move not just to the income accounts, but to the balance sheet accounts, the assets that we have, liquidate the assets, and then pay off the creditors and hopefully then get a clean slate as much as possible after that point in time. Note that if you're on the creditor side of things and someone's saying, hey, look, I don't have the income in order to pay you, I can't pay you because I don't have the income sufficient to do so, you can imagine them saying, hey, look, well, what do you have on the balance sheet side of things? Do you have any real property over there? You know, what kind of car do you have? Do you have a $100,000 car or something like that? Are there things that you could actually sell or liquidate where you could actually pay off the obligations? That's what, the creditor would basically, meaning they would be thinking, well, you could actually pay off the obligation if you do have non-liquid assets that you could then liquidate. And generally, when you're thinking about the normal liquidation process in a bankruptcy, the concept would be to take whatever assets are there, liquidate them, and then pay off in accordance with the ordering of the creditors that you owe. And then hopefully in doing so after that process, then having more of a clean slate at that point in time. Okay, so Chapter 7 bankruptcy, sometimes called liquidation bankruptcy. Businesses going through this type of bankruptcy are usually past the stage of reorganization and must sell off assets to pay their creditors. So when you're thinking about bankruptcy, the first thing you generally want to think of would be, well, is there some way that I can reorganize? And some of the other bankruptcy procedures, are more of a kind of a reorganization type of bankruptcy. The first thing that you might do as an individual, and note here, the process works similarly for individuals. You might first go to the creditors and say, hey, instead of going to bankruptcy, is it possible to go to you and say, look, it's not sustainable for me to basically pay off these debts. Could we possibly work something out? And many times the institution has an incentive to work something out if they agree that it's also unsustainable to pay off the debt due to the fact that if you go through bankruptcy, simply the costs of going through bankruptcy are going to drain some of the assets as well, and the creditors are not going to get as much due to that. So it's in their best interest oftentimes to work with you to try to reorganize so that you could pay off your debts. But if you can't do that, then you'd go through the bankruptcy, then decide obviously which type of bankruptcy you would want to be doing. Chapter 7 being the classic liquidation bankruptcy, but does have problems due to the fact that you would have to liquidate things like possibly real estate through the bankruptcy process. So the bankruptcy court appoints a trustee to ensure that the creditors are paid off in the correct order following the rules of absolute priority. So then what they would do obviously is you'd say, okay, we're going to liquidate everything. And then we're going to basically try to pay off who you owe in accordance with the priority, and whoever isn't up high enough on the list in order to be paid off before the assets are gone is going to be left out. They're not going to get paid, right? So then the priority of the creditors now they're going to be trying to be on the top of the list here. So secured debt takes precedent over unsecured debt in a bankruptcy and is generally first in line to be paid off. So if the debt is secured, which of course, if you're talking about a mortgage on a home or something like that, the home being security, then that's the point that if you were to liquidate it, then you would think the bank would be, fairly high on the list there to be repaid for it. Loans issued by banks or other financial institutions that are secured by a specific asset like a building or a piece of machinery are examples of secured debt. Whatever assets and cash remain after all the secured creditors have been paid are pooled together and distributed to creditors with unsecured debt. So anything that doesn't have the collateral and whatnot is at the end of the line. They're more likely not to get paid because the cash is going to run out after liquidation at some point. That's why you went into bankruptcy. So continuing on, to qualify, the debtor can be a corporation, a small business, or an individual. Individuals are also eligible for another form of bankruptcy, Chapter 13. So Chapter 13 is the other kind of bankruptcy to individuals that's quite common, which we'll take a look at briefly in a second. Obviously, these are just brief overviews of the bankruptcy. Before we do so, let's take a look at Chapter 11 bankruptcy. May also be called reorganization or rehabilitation bankruptcy. It is the most complex form of bankruptcy and usually the most expensive. And that's why basically individuals usually don't use the Chapter 11, usually something like a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13. It is most often used by businesses rather than individuals, including corporations, partnerships, joint ventures, and limited liability companies, or LLCs. Chapter 11 gives a company the opportunity to reorganize its debt and try to reemerge as a healthy business. So instead of basically liquidating, which would be, take out the business here, they try to reorganize with a Chapter 11 process. A case starts with a filing of a petition in a bankruptcy court. The petition may be a voluntary one filed by the debtor, but the petition can also be an involuntary one filed by the creditors who want their money. So the creditors may actually initiate here, and then if you go into the bankruptcy, then the process would be you got that trustee that's going to help the third party is now involved in the process. So the debtor will remain in business while taking initiatives to stabilize its finances. Action may include cutting expenses, selling off assets, and attempting to renegotiate its debt with creditors. This happened under the court's supervision. So now you got the supervision of the court, which is trying to be that third party that's trying to reconcile between the two people and get the finances back under control. So Chapter 13 bankruptcy. So now we're moving to Chapter 13. As part of the financial reorganization of Chapter 13, a debtor must submit as well as follow through with a plan to repay outstanding creditors within 3 to 5 years. So 3 to 5 years. Chapter 13 bankruptcy may also be called wage earners plan. Individuals paid an agreed on monthly amount to an appointed trustee. So you got that third party trustee basically involved here to try to facilitate this process, who should be impartial. Then the Chapter 13 versus Chapter 7. Remember, these are the two that would generally be involved if you're thinking about an individual situation generally. Chapter 11 usually being for businesses more likely. Chapter 7 is the most common form of bankruptcy because it allows individuals to erase their existing debt and start afresh. So when you're thinking about classical bankruptcy, you would think about, okay, I'm just going to wipe out everything. I'm going to pay everything off. I'm going to liquidate everything. I'm going to pay everything off. I'm going to start fresh. Problem with that is if you have substantial fixed assets, which could include real estate, liquidation of those items are often something that people are reluctant to do to start over completely. So that would be a limitation on the Chapter 7 possibly. However, Chapter 7 filers are often required to surrender their home, and that's generally a problem for many people. So once a Chapter 13 bankruptcy is initiated, any home foreclosure proceedings may be ceased.